Welcome to PremisePodcast. This is your host, Angelos Sophocleous. In this episode, I host Lizzie Bestow, a philosophy postgraduate student at the University of Durham. We define what speciesism is, expanding on the work of Michael Tye, Peter Singer, Iris Murdoch, and others. We examine whether non-human animals can be granted personhood, and if yes, on what grounds. We assess the importance of pain and suffering in animals, explore the notion of play in animal-human interaction, and introduce the concept of the standpoint theory in animal ethics. Hello everyone, in this episode I have with me Lizzie Bestow. Hello Lizzie.
Hi.
Lizzie is currently studying her master's degree in Durham and having received her undergraduate from Durham as well. She works primarily on the ethics of eating, specifically the moral standing of animals and whether vegetarianism is a moral ought. Her current research concerns the supposed discriminatory phenomena speciesism and whether it is comparable to other forms of discrimination. She also enjoys aesthetics and the philosophy of beauty, hosting a weekly reading group with the philosophy department in Durham, which is quite successful. She is passionate about improving opportunities within philosophy for those who suffer from mental illness and creating compassionate spaces. As such, she has recently immersed herself in the world of the institutionalized outsider artist, arguing that this particular type of auteur may be precisely the antidote to the profit-driven art world of labeled capitalism. So, do you want to tell me what is speciesism and what your central argument is about speciesism?
Yeah. So speciesism is a term that was coined by Richard Ryder, but most people think that it was coined by Peter Singer, but it wasn't. But it's just that Peter Singer has been the most kind of influential in the kind of argument here. But yeah, it was coined by Richard Ryder, and he used it to refer to a kind of discrimination that's similar to sexism and racism and other sorts of discrimination, ageism and things like that, because he believes that that is the basis of which our feelings towards non-human animals are formed, that it's kind of it's a discrimination that we don't take into consideration sometimes their feelings, especially with like the ethics of eating. That's maybe how he's applying it, but he looked at it in a very broad way, whereas Peter Singer's sort of narrowed that down a little bit to more sort of arguing for a moral ought for vegetarianism and veganism and trying to reduce the meat eating and things like that. Yeah, so essentially it's very hard to kind of say what it particularly is, yes. As it is with racism and sexism, I think, because those definitions have changed a lot. Yes.
Absolutely. So it's the view that we shouldn't favor our own species on top of other species.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
However, it's the case that in terms of survival, we come to sometimes favor our own species. For example, if we have to defend some member of our family or a member of our species, then we could favor killing a member of other species.
Yeah.
Is it something speciesism looks at? Is this speciesism killing another animal for defending a member of your own species?
So I think Peter Singer does, because he's a utilitarian, so he is looking at it very much from that angle. So he's balancing up he's just sort of saying that the species shouldn't be a factor, but for example, if something was attacking you, then you would be able to defend yourself, or if it was sort of like one animal, non-human animal, against 5 people, for example, he's just saying that shouldn't be a factor that we consider in moral decision making. So like, I think one way to look at it would be that there's sort of like factors that make a moral difference and factors that don't make a moral difference, like when you are looking at, so for example, jail. So like you would say that someone needs to go to jail because they've committed a crime, so you are looking at the moral kind of thing that's important is that they, murdered maybe, or they've done something that warrants them being taken out of, the normal kind of having their liberties and things. And a kind of a contingent kind of factor that isn't morally important would be like their hair colour or their eye colour or their race and things like that. But that's what he's trying to kind of say, is that it's comparable to just hair colour or eye colour, in the same way that we would want to say that gender is like that or race is like that, that it matters just as much if a person is white or black as it does if their, you know, eyes are blue or green or, you know, this is the kind of thing. But yeah, Peter Singer, from what I've read, would say that you can absolutely defend. It does not mean that you have to value your species as, or their, you know, and other species as much better, that you have to like kind of waylay your own preferences. It just means that you have to kind of balance up the preferences.
And it's not so simple for us humans in how we deal with other species. It's not only us and them, but we tend to favor some members of other species, and it's the distinction between other animals having intrinsic and instrumental value. So we regard humans as the only animals who have some sort of intrinsic value, and we might also say that for us, for humans in the Western world at least, some animals like dogs and cats, some have intrinsic value. But if we think about this deeper, they have instrumental value because we give value to them because they offer something to us. What would you make of this distinction between intrinsic and instrumental?
I think this is something that they do pick up on. I know that they are talking about there was talk about the Yulin Meat Festival, I think, in China, yeah, and they were, as one of, I read somebody was saying, like, it's very ironic that people are up in arms about this, but then they would go home and eat like chicken or something, and what's the kind of distinction here? And I think a lot of it is, it's more of an instrumental thing. But then I do think some aspects of our lives with dogs and cats, especially with dogs, like that's what my recent kind of research has been on, looking at like the terms of like play. So when you play with an animal, with a dog, like you get to sort of, you both enter into that play and you both share an experience that you don't maybe when you have a fish, or, you know, because you just, it seems very separate there. You're just looking at them, you're just watching them, and they're swimming around the bowl, and you know, there's no like interpersonal relationship there. But with a dog, there does seem to be, you know, the whole man's best friend and thing. And I think that is, I don't know whether that would impact, I don't think that impacts on their value maybe, but I would say that it makes it much easier to form a moral kind of connection with them, definitely.
Yes, and this is a point that Iris Murdoch also builds. I know you have studied here. And she's getting into this by trying to encourage us to get into the other's shoes, and not only in getting into another human's shoes in order to understand them, but also get into the animal's shoes. Try to see from their perspective, try to see from a non-human perspective. And in this way we come to get connected with them, and play is one way of getting connected with them, as a sort of Wittgensteinian approach to the issue. And it's through play that we come to get connected with other people, but also with some animals. And the very fact that we can play with animals shows that we share some sort of underlying foundational rules with them. We don't have to agree on those foundational rules. We have some rules that they're so natural, so basic and foundational, that we agree on the rules of play. You can imagine an alien species with which it will be incredibly difficult to play something, because we would have so much different foundational rules that we wouldn't be able to engage in playing.
Definitely. It's kind of like how with chess and games like that, you need to know the format, but with play with the dogs, when you're just running with your dog, because I know, because I have a dog that I talk about all the time, almost all the time, and like I know when I play with her and we just run together or things, there doesn't need to be any sort of foundational logical kind of argument here. You don't need to sit down and like think, oh, will she understand? You just do it instinctively, and there's this kind of like assumed understanding there that even allows the game to take place, definitely. And I know that's what one of our professors, Simon James, talks a lot about, like in one of his papers that I read. He's talking about this kind of like understanding here that kind of transcends any kind of inability to communicate that we have with animals. It's kind of like it goes beyond that. It's at the very foundation of our ability to play with them. And it reminds me a lot of how I read the book for my dissertation last year by Michael Tye, and it was about whether animals are conscious, and he says that people often make the argument, oh, we know human beings are conscious because now we have a lot of understanding of the brain, but we don't know whether non-human animals are conscious. Maybe we know ones that have similar brains to us, but we're not sure about the other ones and such and such. And he says, well, it doesn't really come down to that. It comes down to behaviour, because he says that in ancient Greece they weren't just going around whacking someone on the head, just like, oh, they might not be conscious, or they, because they didn't know anything about the brain then, because they didn't have any of these. So by that logic, they could just do whatever. But it's kind of like, no, it's foundational to just civilization, and that kind of, I think that does, it definitely, it is between human animals and non-human animals, that kind of basic perceptual understanding when you enter into communication with other human animals and communication through play with non-human animals. There's a sort of foundational understanding there that you are playing the same game, that you both get the rules of the game, that you don't have to sit down and kind of discuss it.
So there must be a very foundational biological structure that unites both of us, and allows us to engage into activities such as play. You mentioned Tye's theory of animal consciousness. Do you want to talk more about that? Explain what he thinks about animal consciousness?
I really enjoy reading about it. It was very interesting. He says a lot of different things, and he reaches some conclusions that I was a bit unhappy that he reached, but because I thought it was good. I really liked his argument up until the conclusion, but I didn't believe the conclusion sort of followed. But he thinks that essentially we can look through behaviour, so it should be an inference to the best explanation as to whether an animal is conscious or not. And he says that that often people, as with these debates, it's kind of, sometimes it's easier to frame it in what the opposition have said. So there's this another philosopher he talks about, who says that, or maybe animals are just feeling sort of like echoes of pain that aren't real pain, that's not really like what we're feeling, or just they're not really feeling real pain, they're not really feeling real pleasure and things like that. They're just like kind of machines, kind of like what Descartes said. And he says, well, if they were, why would that make sense? Why would the animal jump away from something that causes them pain? If it didn't cause them any pain, then that would be useless. That wouldn't work. It has to have some kind of, he thinks it's a biological thing, definitely an evolutionary thing that's evolved, but he says that still makes it morally relevant. And he essentially believes that it's very hard to draw a line between species, which I really liked. He says that there's kind of groups of animals that have maybe a higher level of consciousness, you could say, but there will be variation within any group, as there is within humans. Like, sadly, if someone kind of is in a coma or something, then they have a very kind of lower level of consciousness than they maybe had before. And he says that he believes that this kind of can be the case across other groups of animals, but he believes that we can sort of look at where an animal becomes conscious and not. So he thinks that insects are probably not conscious because they don't seem to have both he does it in two stages. So he does the behavioural aspect and also the biological aspect, but he believes the behavioural aspect should always come first. So if an animal has brain chemistry that looks very different to ours, but it still behaves in a very similar way, or behaves in a way that seems to suggest it's feeling pain and pleasure, then that should be taken into account first. But in many cases, we know with chickens and pigs and things that they have somewhat similar kind of brain, and so with the behaviour, we can pretty much say, we cannot be certain, but we can say that they are indeed conscious. He believes that insects don't really have this here, that they lack both the brain and the kind of, well, not a brain, but the kind of brain that we have, and also that they lack the nervous system and things, and also that they don't have this behavioural aspect. They will just kind of keep, if something sort of cuts off a leg or something, they would keep running towards that thing that's causing the bodily organism damage. But then he concludes that species is still a factor, and I think that's what drew me to look at speciesism so much, because I was so unsatisfied with that conclusion, because I'm not sure whether I think it's analogous to sexism, but I do think it's much more important than he considers it. He just sort of says, well, we cannot help but be speciesist, and I think, well, just because we cannot help that doesn't mean it's not, something that we should strive towards.
Yeah. And does it matter though if insects have lower level of consciousness? Does it matter in the way we are treating them? Should we treat an insect in a different way than we treat a dog? What's the argument for that?
So I was reading a lot about it, and I think some scientists are saying that to kind of reverse all of the climate change, and I think we've gone past that point, but sort of like help to reverse as much as we can and help to kind of preserve the environment and things like that, we should start eating insects. That's what they believe, because there's so many of them and if they don't have any kind of sense of pain or pleasure or any sense of themselves or any sort of conscious really experience, then I think we probably could have a little munch of the insects. And also I know that that sort of the a lot of like Asian food is sometimes there can be insects in Asian food, like there's a Chinese hot ant soup or something, I think. I read that. So that kind of thing, that's like morally good, fine, or morally kind of neutral. Whereas the mainly Western diet, like we were saying, of meat eating, that would be considered not as good on that thing.
It's an interesting question, though. Where do we draw the line? Where does one being become conscious? Where does it attain consciousness? Whether it's always conscious, whether it has some different kind of consciousness. Like we may discover that worms, for example, may have a different sort of understanding of sentiency and the consciousness that we cannot grasp. So it's always the case that we have a very anthropocentric view of dealing with any question in philosophy, but in particularly in this case, we cannot fail to view other animals through our own understanding.
Absolutely, we can't help but import our own ideas about consciousness, because for us, when we're trying to look for evidence of consciousness, we'll always inadvertently compare it to our own experience, I think, because there must be so many different types of perception that we miss in animals. With science now improving, we can see that they are evidences of perception and things, but and consciousness, but we didn't see that before. And I think definitely that there is many things that is very anthropocentric. It is, but it is a case of, unfortunately, I believe that we cannot help but be like that.
And as you mentioned, that insects, for example, do not have a capacity to reason or talk or be conscious in our own terms, and that they cannot suffer. I will quote Bentham here, who deals with animal rights, and says that the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And it seems that this goes against the theory of applying intrinsic value to animals, because if they have intrinsic value, then the question of whether they suffer or not is not relevant. Even if we could find a way to kill an animal without it suffering, it would still be wrong. It would still be wrong to kill a human if we found a way in which they would not suffer. If I found if I could inject you with something that could kill you, but you wouldn't be able to understand that you were dying, that you would feel no pain, it will still be wrong to kill you. So why is it wrong then?
This is a tough one.
On what grounds? If the criterion is not pain, then what is it? What is it that provides this intrinsic value?
Well, I would say that there is instances of consciousness without sentience, but there's never instances of sentience without consciousness. So there's Michael Tye talks about children that were born without a neocortex in their brain. So this means that they don't have any sort of sentience, that they can't feel anything and things like that. But they are still perceptual beings. They can follow like a light in front of them, and obviously their parents care about them, and they to end their life would still be wrong, many people would say, and so I think that that's important, the consciousness aspect. The sentience does play into it. I would say that's not something that grounds the value, but that just adds an extra set of values that we have to like take into consideration. But with like those children, then the sentience isn't really a factor, so that we don't have to take that into consideration. But the consciousness is still there, and this is, I don't think there's that many cases where there's consciousness without sentience, but there's always sentience with consciousness, because that's like part of what but it's not a criteria, but it's kind of because Michael Tye does look at this, and he says that there's no kind of criteria for consciousness, because then we'll be importing our own human stuff on it, and we can always find more kind of things that show consciousness, but it's kind of evidence for it. So if you see that something is sentient, you know it's sentient, you know it's going to be conscious. But in the same sense, there can be beings that don't have that sentience. So I guess I would say that the consciousness is more what grounds it, but the sentience does indeed add extra kind of values. Like I do think with human beings, then we have an extra set of values to consider, because there's definitely ways that there are to be a human being that's very different to ways there are to be a non-human being. But I don't think that means that being a non-human animal is any less. It's just that we don't have to consider those values.
Mm-hmm. So you would see sentience as being over and above consciousness. It's something that adds to us being to self-realizing our own consciousness, or have a sort of understanding of ourselves. Basically, it's not that we are simply acting through our biological dispositions. So this is kind of different understanding of consciousness. I would say most would understand consciousness as self-consciousness, as being self-aware. But you're saying consciousness is just being an entity which uses its biological dispositions to guide itself in the world.
Definitely. So I know like my partner does stuff on like this kind of thing about how there's two different types of consciousness, and he believes that like there's a kind of more base consciousness, and then there's self-awareness, and he does it in relation to schizophrenia, saying that people with very severe schizophrenia, they often don't have that self-consciousness, and they don't have that kind of I, I'm doing this, I'm going to the shops, I'm going to the philosophy department, but they have the kind of more basic, but it's not meant in a bad way, but just that they don't really, because of the condition they're suffering from in very severe cases, that they don't have that kind of the self-consciousness in their kind of worst times, but that this doesn't mean that they're any less valuable, or that. And I think that there is definitely cases of this. So like with dogs and things, I don't know if they have a sense of I, and that is what Michael Tye does talk about a lot, about that self-consciousness versus consciousness, and that's why he believes that there is a kind of baser level of consciousness, because he says that there might be some sort of I that they have, that a dog has, that they have a sense of themselves, but we don't know, and it seems probably not. But he does not think that takes away from the value. But I'd say that maybe it does add another set of values that we have to look at and you have to consider.
Absolutely. It's the case that most animals that we interact with, or most animals that we consider to be intelligent, they pass the mirror test. When they see themselves in the mirror, they recognize themselves. So apart from some funny videos with cats who jump when they see themselves in the mirror, most animals, they don't see the animal in the mirror as some other animal. They recognize that. They say, that's me, that's my reflection. So they must have an understanding of themselves as an entity, as a different entity.
I know that Michael Tye talks about a case where there's a dog who barks up at his master who's on the bed to be carried up onto the bed, and he says that could this be a sign, or he thinks probably not, but it could be a sign that the dog at least has some basic level of, I know I'm too small to get up onto the bed, so I need some sort of understanding of height, in terms of I know I'm not big enough to get onto there, whereas he's not going to bark when he sees a little table in front of him or something, because he knows he can jump up onto there. But so there must be some sort of, he thinks there's but he I think he dismisses that and says, well, it might not be, but there could be something there. I guess this is part of the problem with consciousness, is no There's no certainty there. There's just no way to know what's going on. I think they call it the problem of other minds. So there's no possibility to know of what's going on in another person, and whether they are conscious, and that caused all this like people thinking solipsism, or whatever, people thinking, oh, I'm just the only conscious one, sort of like ideas, because there's something you see in the humans as well, which I think is what Michael Tye was trying to get at with his remark about the ancient Greek peoples, of saying, well, you can question it all the way back to I am the only one that's conscious. So you do have to kind of make some assumptions based on behaviour so as to have that kind of normal interaction in life.
Yes, yeah. It's a case that even though we have problem with other minds, and it's a valid problem in philosophy, at least through behaviorism, we can understand the inner state of other humans through the way they behave. If I see you crying or laughing, this does not only tell me that you're happy or that you're sad. I can feel what you're feeling, because I've been sad, I've been happy, I've cried, I've laughed, so I know what you're feeling. The problem of other minds seems to be the problem of other human minds. With animals, it seems to be beyond someone's understanding what it means to say, to feel like a dog, or to feel like a cat or a bat. That's referring to the famous paper by Thomas Nagel, what it's like to be a bat. And even though we come to understand in a different way what it means to be another human, we do have some difficulty in understanding, getting into another animal's mind. No matter how close we come to communicate with them and play with them and interact with them, it seems to be, there always seems to be a problem in having the viewpoint of those animals. Do you think it's possible to attain a non-human viewpoint, or see the world through the eyes of another animal?
I think it could be. I think it is very difficult, and this is sort of where I was looking at standpoint theory, and they were saying that there's no way, it's a sort of feminist idea, that there's no way to see beyond your certain situation, because certain things happen to you in the world because of your certain situation in the world, and I think that there is that problem, probably a little bit more so with non-human animals, but I think with many animals, non-human animals, we can interact with them, and we can, like through play and things like that, we can surpass those kind of problems, because I think that those problems are present with humans as well. I know that when women were fighting for the right to vote, there was so I think it was Wollstonecraft wrote this paper on on the vindication of the rights of women, and then an anonymous scholar who was from Oxbridge, but I can't remember if it was Oxford or Cambridge, he wrote a paper on the vindication of the rights of brutes, and he said that if women were going to be given the vote, then you may as well give the vote to the dog or to the cat, which just sounds ridiculous to us now, but I always think of that time, and I think at that time people just kind of accepted that, and women too probably, there was obviously women that were fighting for the right to vote, but I think a lot of women probably just accepted that and thought, well, we are just so different from men, and that was a lot of it was put on the differences. And maybe there are some differences between men and women, I think possibly. Biologically, there are some differences, but I don't think that they're insurpassable. I think that they're definitely, that we can focus on the similarities. And I think that's a paper I read by Joel Marks. He was talking about what makes us similar to human animals and how we should value that, and not focus on the differences but on the similarities. And they were talking about how our bodies break down and how animals' bodies break down as well. And I know when Rosie hurts her paw and she comes to me or my mum or my dad and my brother, and she's upset, and you sort of have that feeling there, you understand what it's like even if it's to hurt your hand, which is obviously different to a paw, you kind of get the feeling there, very much like what you were talking about when you see someone crying or happy. And I think there is that kind of that kind of experience can be found in non-human animals, but I think it definitely does. Some animals like fish, it's very hard to kind of interact with them, and I know that there's some apes, I think there's some monkeys that Michael Tye talks about experiencing something he calls autonoetic consciousness or something. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but he says that's a sense of like past, present and future. And so that's why he believes that it would be wrong to put a monkey in a cage or something, because it has a sense of itself as being apart from that cage, and it sees its whole life in that cage, and that's what part of what makes it sad. Whereas if you just exist from moment to moment, then you don't feel that kind of profound sadness. You don't see, oh, I'm going to be in this cage forever. You just live from moment to moment. So a guinea pig in a cage is kind of okay, and it keeps the guinea pig safe. But a monkey in a cage, that would be kind of problematic. So that's kind of like what he's looking at there, I think, is how differently it is between species, and how different species maybe can communicate with us in different ways and share different experiences with us, because we also have that sense of past, present and future. So that's something we can share with the monkey.
Is this connected to the standpoint theory, what you're saying?
I think so. Like my work has tried to connect the two, but like.
You want to explain what I know you've been writing about the standpoint theory.
Oh, so like
Yeah.
So the standpoint theory, they're looking at like about how the standpoint theory would sort of say that very much your position in the world is determined by the kind of, you know, race or gender or you are and things like this, and certain things happen to you because of that, your position in the world, and that's very important. And this was actually something I was thinking about, like having a discussion with a friend, which I think is one of the reasons I really like philosophy, because it just impacts on my life so much. Like, and I was having a discussion with a friend because he walks home with me when I get the bus with him, and then I was trying to explain to him how sometimes when he doesn't walk home with me, that it can be quite scary. Late at night, like I've been followed and things like that. Like someone has like followed me half the way home, and you know it's quite scary. And I tried to explain these sort of things, and he well-meaningly kind of shrugged it off and said, "Well, that's never happened when I've been with you." And that made me think a lot about standpoint theory, and I was explaining it to one of our professors and saying how irritated I was that he was saying these things, and the professor said, "That's standpoint theory." And he said that basically the problem here is that because certain things are happening to me and because of my position in the world as a woman, and certain things are happening to him because of his position in the world as a man, that the two cannot come together, because when he's with me he doesn't see that, because that doesn't happen, because those types of men, they see when a kind of bigger than them man is there, then they won't make those kind of comments. But like he won't ever see what it's like to be me by myself, because when he's with me that doesn't happen. So it's sort of like it's very much dependent on your position in the world as to actually what you're experiencing, and how this is it's not a kind of, it's not a moral fault that he can't understand this. It's because of his position in the world, that like even though he's not one of these men that are making these comments, and he's very lovely, he just cannot surpass that because of his position in the world as a man. And then they kind of also said that about race and, you know, all different sort of sexuality, like certain things there. But I've tried to kind of put the two together about the play elements that Simon James was talking about, and that Iris Murdoch was talking about with the drama, watching a drama unfold, like when you go to the theatre, and how that you kind of get lost in the drama, and you get an understanding of how it is to be a character, even though that character is completely fictional, could be completely fictional. Like, I like when she says about how King Lear, you get an understanding to be King Lear, even if, you know, you're not a man, or you're not a king, or you've not got children, or you're not old, but you have an understanding of how it is to kind of lose a kingdom, or lose your children, and grow old, and sort of like that kind of loss of power there, and yearning for something that once was, and you get a sort of feeling of that, even though you've never been in that position before. And that's where I think that those two can come together, and that play and drama and things like that can surpass the standpoint that we are put in the world. And I think that that's like when we play with the dog, you just immerse yourself in the game. Like when I play with Rosie, I'm not sitting there thinking like, oh, you know, and apart from thinking what's she gonna do next, you know, so I can keep playing with her. Like I don't sit and think about how is she understanding the game and things like that. I'm just in the game, and I'm just enjoying it with her, and she's in the game as well. We're both sharing that experience, and understanding one another, and I think that can overcome those standpoints and those problems there. Yeah.
Yeah, the fact that we are trying to be on the same level as a dog when we play with them, or even with a human baby.
Yeah.
We do things that we wouldn't normally do with other people, and things that if we did them with normal people someone would be called as crazy or stupid or awkward, like talking in a high-pitched voice, using words that you normally don't use with humans, or engaging in play behavior that as humans we tend to do less and less as we grow up. So it's kind of, we try to bring ourselves to the same level as other humans or other animals, and we do this in an attempt to make ourselves understand what it's like to be them. But of course it's kind of impossible, not kind of possible, it is impossible to think exactly like a dog does, or to think exactly like a baby does. And even if we've all been babies or children or teenagers, we've lost the ability to think as they do or as we did in the past. Although we can kind of remember in some cases what was it like to be a teenager, and we might try to assimilate that in our everyday experience right now, but yeah, the only thing we can do now is interact with those groups of people or with those animals in an attempt to bring ourselves to the same level, so that we manage to make this interaction happen and try to see through their viewpoint what it's like to be them.
Definitely.
So it seems that even when we play with other animals or like humans, we try to bring ourselves at the same level, and in being at the same level we manage to understand what it's like to be them, or understand an aspect of them that we do not see otherwise. For example, when we play with a dog, we don't play in the same way or do the same activities that we would do with a spider. In fact, with a spider, the activities we can do are much more limited. So this gives us the opportunity to understand what it's like to be a dog, not see through the eyes of a dog, but understand the aspect of what it's like to be a dog in contrast to other animals. And this applies to the standpoint theory in trying to get into the other's shoes, even if it's not biologically possible to see through an animal's eyes. At least through interacting, we are able to understand some aspect of what it's like to be them.
Definitely. The standpoint theorists would probably kind of say that the particular the particular position we have in the world means that we can't really overcome any kind of, we can't really see beyond that. But I think that through play and things like that, we can. That the two theories can kind of like come together. Although, yeah, the standpoint theorists would be probably resistant and say, well, there are certain things that happen to an individual because of, a certain way that they are, and that we can't go beyond that because that constitutes our experience itself. So like the things that happen to you make up your experience, so you can't see beyond your experience. But I think that things like play and things that they go beyond that. You enter into a sort of experience together. It's like a shared experience that you're at the same level almost, that you don't maybe have with other experiences.
And just on a slightly different topic within the rise to animals, you have argued in your papers that in the concept of personhood, that we should apply personhood to animals and consider them to be people. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I think certain elements of personhood, there can be definitely that some animals could constitute persons, most definitely, like the monkeys that we're talking about that have the level of consciousness, they can see past, present and future versions of themselves, kind of consider those in their understanding of themselves. And I think that the self and things like that, that's the kind of idea that makes up personhood that could be applied to a lot of animals. I think maybe if the dog, like we were saying with the bed, when he wanted to jump up on the bed, if he had a sense of himself with the mirror test and things like that, there's a sort of sense of personhood there. And I know that Christine Korsgaard talks about the prey and predator aspect of a lot of animals living in the wild, and how the predator will position itself outside of the direct sight line of the prey, but around the prey so that it can access the prey. And this is kind of a basic level of self, because it must know it's a self to be able to position itself away from other objects. It must have a distinction between itself as an animal and that other animal as an animal, or something different from a rock, or because it knows it can move away. It knows I have to stay close to this animal but still stay out of its line of sight, because it knows that certain characteristics there that animal possesses are certain characteristics that rocks and things don't possess. So it must have that kind of, like what Sartre was saying about the being for itself and the being in itself, it must have an element of being for itself there, because it knows itself to be conscious at maybe some more basic level probably than what we have, but that kind of constitutes a lot of what people are saying about personhood, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's important that you mentioned Sartre here.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. So it seems to be not only humans that have the being for themselves,
mm-hmm.
but some animals as well. Although they live very much in the present. Non-human animals, they may not have goals for the future and aims about the future, or think deeply about the past.
Mm-hmm.
We can say that they are not just beings in themselves. Beings
mm-hmm.
in themselves being the term that Sartre used for an object, something that is an object in its own merit, in the sense that it can have other beings apply characteristics to it.
Yeah, definitely.
And just a more general question about the applying personhood to animals. Why would you say that it's a better idea to apply personhood to animals and not expand the scope of human rights to apply to animals? So instead of talking about human rights, we can talk of animal rights, including humans as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we can still say that persons are humans, but by expanding the scope of human rights to include other animals as well. This is another way in which we can achieve giving human rights to animals. I think this would probably give a more direct way of giving rights to animals.
Mm.
It seems that through the personhood argument, animals gain their rights through them being persons, while if we directly give rights to them, it seems as we give rights to them because of their own merit, of their own existence as animals.
Mm.
How would you say about these two constructing?
I think that
views?
personhood would probably be a way to achieve animals having rights and things quicker, just because that a lot of kind of moral beliefs that people have tend to revolve around persons, I think, in a kind of underhand way. And I think that persons are often considered to be or human beings mostly, that have inviolable rights, that those rights cannot be violated and they are absolute. So like it's most often seen in the abortion debate when people say, oh, you know, this fetus is a person, and so that's kind of saying, well, you don't have the right to take, you know, you. So I think with personhood, it's like it kind of encompasses all of the rights often, because it's kind of what we were talking about earlier, the intrinsic and the instrumental. I think if you just expanded the kind of human rights to include animals, it would still be sort of an instrumental kind of understanding of an animal. But if we, in sort of like ordinary language philosophy, referred to animals as persons, some animals as persons, then they would get sort of the whole package of rights, and they would be seen as intrinsically good, because I think that's what is often used to kind of mean it's like sort of a way to not so sort of like when they use that as an example against utilitarianism, when people say, oh, well, you cannot just, you know, someone walk into a hospital, and there's that old argument, and then they kind of you know, their liver or whatever, heart and things are used to help 5 or 6 others. Well, why can't you do that? Or because they're a person, or there's this kind of understanding of of basic dignity there, or some sort of base level kind of like inviolable rights that someone has that are like, yeah, there's an intrinsic kind ofness, I think that, and I think that that's what we should kind of focus on, just for the kind of ordinary language aspect, because I think people do cling on to that personhood. And I think it is sort of ironic that people will argue about the personhood of a fetus, which doesn't seem to me that it has many characteristics, especially in the early stages of what they are really talking about, and yet many animals are not considered persons, well they're not, and I think that they're much more likely candidates for personhood.
Animals are extremely intelligent in ways that we cannot even grasp sometimes.
Definitely.
I was reading about octopi recently, that when they try to attract a mate, the front of their body, if I can say their body, they change into colors that would attract their mate, while their back they change into colors that would deter predators. So the fact that they can change colors and understand that these colors are in one way deterring predators and in another way attracting their mate is a kind of intelligence that we do not grasp how it might work.
No, definitely.
So we should try to be less anthropocentric in other kinds of intelligence.
I think a lot of the behaviour that animals possess is very developed. Like Michael Tye was talking about shell-shock crabs and saying about how that's what the title of his book is, Tense Bees and Shell-shock Crabs, I think, Animals Conscious, and that's what he's talking about, the shell-shock crabs. And he basically says that these crabs, if you shock their shells a little bit, then they will stay in the shell for fear of going outside and predators and such. But if you increase the shock, they will each different levels, but get to a certain level where they want to move outside and go and seek a different home, or try to get away. And he says that's trade-off behavior, and that's like very developed kind of behavior. That's behavior that we have, but we sometimes don't know we're doing it. Things like that. It's like people staying in really unhappy relationships or whatever, that they won't actually go beyond because they're afraid of the kind of the out there, the being by themselves, so they'll stay in an unhappy situation. And I feel like that explains a lot of like human behaviour in a way as well. Like I know that like my mum was talking about a situation where a friend of hers with that kind of that position, that she was very unhappy but wouldn't leave, and I said about the crabs and how like that was trade-off behaviour, and I feel like that it can give us an insight into human behaviour. And I think like as well we have to remember that so much of what we take for granted now wasn't taken for granted before, like with the women, the thing about the right to vote and stuff like that. Like I remember reading about, there was somebody that did about moral stages of moral development, and he said that sort of like that boys in school and things reach a higher stage basically, and they reach that stage much earlier, and that's a stage of rationality, and sort of like, and he says that women tend to be more emotional, and they sort of like he gives the example of playing games in the playground, and he says that the boys are much more likely to, if one of the boys breaks the rules, then they say, no, you can't do that, you're out of the game now. And if girls are playing with each other, then they tend to like allow that girl who's broken the rules to go back into the group. And he says it's sort of like a phenomenon. He uses that, this was sort of in the 70s or 80s I think, to say that men were more sort of like morally superior in a way, but not, I don't think he intentionally meant it like that, but that's how it kind of came across, and or to me anyway. And then like recently we have the phenomena of care ethics and things like that, and saying that actually care and emotion is very important, and we have to remember that a lot of philosophy is done on the backdrop of sort of this idea of the Kantian rational man or woman, that's the idea of the best human being is to be so rational. I think in the West definitely, whereas it does differ, but in this country definitely that is the kind of the background of British analytic kind of like philosophy and all this sort of logic and things, and that shapes our understanding, and that's sort of what standpoint theory is looking at as well. But I think that also shapes our understanding of animals as well, in terms of how they look to us, whether they look like humans or whether they look like Joel Marx, who we talked about earlier. He says about the distinction between moral patient and moral agent, and he says that basically he says that when you have this is quite funny, but he says when you have a child that when it's growing up and you don't and they say, oh, what are we having for dinner? And you say, oh, we're having, this toast. And he says, oh, I just don't want that. You don't just go and chuck your child in the river. Or he says, there's the same thing as when the cat is being very angry and sort of ignoring you and doesn't want to come and have a cuddle. And then you don't just not feed it for 3 days. You still have to, you still have to, you have certain obligations that you have to fulfill that isn't based on sort of a contract, as we would see it in kind of the rational Western way of thinking. Is always this way of I do something for you, therefore you do something for me, kind of we enter into a contract kind of understanding. But Joel Marx is saying that, well, there can be situations where the cat might do nothing for us, but we still feel an obligation, and part of having a cat is just to feel that obligation and to do that, and that adds to your life, even if the cat is not really adding much by being very abrasive and things. And I think that's kind of important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It seems that through the Kantian perspective it's impossible to ascribe intrinsic value to animals.
Mm-hmm,
it seems that through the Kantian perspective, animals only have instrumental value.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, most definitely, they would definitely. He says that animals, that it's wrong to hurt an animal, because if someone hurts an animal, they're much more likely to hurt other humans. But most people hear that and they're just this is really bad. Yeah, and I mean that is true of what I've heard from psychopaths and things, that they do tend to kind of really hurt animals when they're young, but I don't think that's what's wrong with it. I mean, that's probably is a true fact, possibly, that they do tend to hurt animals and they're more likely to hurt humans. But there's something about hurting the animal in itself that's the problem, that's morally problematic, not that it causes you to be more mean to humans. And I think that is definitely, although Christine Korsgaard, the lady that we spoke about earlier with the prey and predator, she tries to argue from a Kantian perspective that these animals have a minimum level of rationality, and so they can be considered ends in themselves, not means to an end. But I think that's a little bit misguided, because Kant quite clearly said, he wasn't really for the animal rights. So I don't really think that kind of theory works. I think this kind of phenomenological way and Wittgenstein and these sort of ideas that are more looking at behaviours and not just rationalization is more important. The sort of the feelings there that we talked about, the feelings that you get when you play with an animal and the immersion in the experience, that's something that you can't sort of rationalize, but it's just something that's there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It even seems that Kant goes against his own project by saying that it's wrong to herd animals because it will lead to negative consequences. He's kind of taking a consequentialist perspective
Definitely.
here, not a deontological one.
No.
And that he doesn't say it's wrong to kill animals because it's wrong to kill animals. It's wrong to herd other conscious or sentient beings. He sees this through a consequentialist perspective.
Definitely. I never thought about it. It's completely true. And ironically, when he says about the axe murderer coming to someone's house, I think someone asked him, what would you say about the axe murderer? And then you come into your house and asking, where's the friend that he wants to kill? And they're in the house, and he says it's wrong to lie, so you'd still have to tell the truth. And the person asks, but your friend would die, and you say, oh well, it's wrong to lie, so maybe you should have put the consequentialism in there a little bit as well, if he was gonna
Absolutely. So I would really like to thank you for your participation in the podcast.
Thank you.
All the best to you.
Thank you.
You have just listened to Premise Podcast. Subscribe to Premise Podcast on YouTube and make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook. The podcast is also available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Soundcloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please consider supporting Premise Podcast on Patreon to help bring philosophy to the public. See you next week. Thanks for listening.